So let's talk about some threat modeling. Now in this threat modeling, we're going to talk about identifying threats, talk about some potential attacks, the reduction analysis, and remediating our threats. So when we're identifying our threats, we are looking to see what could happen as far as who is going to attack us, in other words. So threat modeling is a procedure for optimizing network, application, internet security by identifying objects, and we're going to be looking for those vulnerabilities, again, those weaknesses, and then defining countermeasures to prevent or mitigate the effects of threats to the system. So a threat, remember that threat is the potential or actual undesirable event that may be malicious. Could be accidental or incidental as well. Remember, humans, they could be incidental threats. Could be malicious threat though, like a DOS attack, SYNFLOOD, things like that. So in the threat modeling process, we need to know some terms here. First, we'll have the assessment scope. This is identifying tangible assets like databases of information or sensitive files is usually pretty easy. Now, understand the capabilities provided by the application and putting a value on them is a little bit more difficult because we can look at a database and say, well, this data could be worth so much because if it lost, we blah, blah, blah. But the value of how it's used could be a little bit different. Now, less concrete things like reputation and the goodwill are the most difficult to measure. Remember, we talked about that being an intangible asset, but a lot of times they're pretty critical, if not the most critical. We can have data loss, and that's going to cost X amount of dollars, but we can get that back. We can get the data, create more data, have more data. But if we lose something and then it affects our reputation, how people perceive us, that may have long-lasting consequences. You lost the trust, the goodwill of customers believing things are going to be okay with your organization. So that's going to lead to revenue losses as well, because now people may not want to shop at your online store because you get hacked or you've gotten hacked and you lost 50,000 people's identifiable information. People tend to look down on that, right? Another term, possible attacks. So a key part of the threat model is the characterization of different groups of people who might be able to attack an application. Now, these could be insiders. They could be outsiders as well, and a lot of the times they are. And it could be inadvertent mistakes, accidents, or malicious attacks. But we have to think of the possible attacks or the possibility of which threats are coming to get us, if you will. And then we've talked about countermeasures. The model must include any and all existing countermeasures already deployed within the enterprise. So in our threat model process, we're going to take what we have and put that in place and say, well, we have this countermeasure, we have this control to stop or to mitigate that threat. Vulnerabilities. Once we have an understanding of the security in the application, now we can analyze them for new weaknesses or new vulnerabilities. So the focus needs to be on vulnerabilities that connect the possible attack that we identified to the negative consequences that we've identified. So how is this going to affect this, and how are they getting in? Which vulnerability are they going to exploit or use? Then we're going to have prioritized identified risks. Now, prioritization is everything in threat modeling because there are always, I guess that's safe to say, always a lot of risks that simply do not rate any attention, right? Because, well, we know it's going to happen. We're getting scanned. Okay, that's fine. I'm not going to worry about that. I've got bigger fish to take care of, right? I don't need to worry about that. There's nothing happening with that. They're just looking. Now, for each threat, you estimate a number of likelihood and impact factors to determine an overall risk or that overall severity level. So you may think, well, port scanning or a ping sweep just to see if we're live may be a low level, right? The severity level could be low. But if they are DOSing us or getting through our perimeter controls, that may be medium to severe in our severity level, depending on how far they're getting in, right? Now, we want to identify countermeasures to reduce the threat. So the last step is to identify countermeasures to get that risk to acceptable levels where we feel comfortable with that. Okay, well, okay, this is happening and this is happening. We're putting this in place. We're stopping that action. We're stopping that threat from accessing that vulnerability. So we're good with that. But this one, we're having a hard time stopping that one. It's every 10% of the time they're getting in. Well, that may be acceptable levels to you. Now, we also have some potential attacks like tailgating, phishing, social engineering, baiting. We talked a little bit about tailgating earlier. I used that in one of the examples where somebody may follow you into the building, right? They're tailgating you. They're right on your rear, if you will, on entering in to, say, a secured facility. They may say they have a badge. They may have like a big heavy coat on. I can't get to it, or I can't get in my purse, or I can't access my badge. Can I come in behind you? Now, they may not try to trick you. They may just be walking behind you. You open the door and they just grab it and walk on in like they do belong there. A lot of the times on penetration testing, that's a very popular one to do because it's easy to do. Right? There's no technical know-how when it comes to tailgating. You get close enough to somebody, you can capture an open door, you can walk on in. Hopefully, they are following policy and will stop you, ask you, escort you to where you need to go to find out if you're really supposed to be there. It goes back to our access control, right? Phishing attempts, you probably heard about this. They've been around for a while, but phishing attempts, you may get an email saying your bank has been compromised. Click on this link to update your information. And there'll be a link in the email that maybe looks legit. And you click on it, but it takes you to some other website. It's not really yours. It may look like yours because there's tools out there that can actually mirror your bank website and make it look just like it. So I could craft a link, put it in an email, make it look like mybank.com, but what it really takes you to is maybe an IP address somewhere, and you're hitting a bogus server, but it looks just like yours. You may not pay attention to the URL because you clicked on it in an email. Everything's fine, right? You type in your credentials and hit submit. Well, now I just captured your credentials. I've taken those and put those in a hidden field and forwarded on your information to the legit application, the legit banking website, and it may log you in, and now you can see things. But all the while, I still captured your information. So now, once you go in and do whatever you need to do, I still captured your credentials. Social engineering. Phishing is kind of a social engineering, and social engineering is a huge topic in all itself. But you can do different things with social engineering, like phishing, like we just talked about. Right? You can do spear phishing. You could do vishing, calling people, trying to get them to give you information. You could do whaling, going after emails with people with lots of high access, CEOs, CIOs, COOs. You could do dumpster diving. You could do eavesdropping. You could do shoulder surfing. You can do direct interaction with people with social engineering. What you're trying to do is get them to give up information without them really knowing it, right? You're just talking to them, carrying on a conversation, and you're trying to get pieces, again, of that puzzle to plug it in so you can get the big picture. You start talking to them about your parents. Yeah, my parents, I think my parents went to school with your parents. Didn't they graduate in 63? Oh, yeah, right, 65. Yeah, or something like that. Or say, didn't we go to school together? What'd you graduate? I graduated in 95. Oh, yeah, 94. So now you kind of get an idea how old they are, right? Most people graduate when they're 17 or 18, so now you can get their age within a certain age group. So that's just an example, but like you can get different information just by talking to them, working off the goodwill and the trust of people wanting to help. And then baiting. You're trying to get them to give you information, right? You're baiting them into going to somewhere. So different potential attacks that we could have. Now we also have a reduction analysis. So how does an individual avoid being a victim in the first place? How can we keep them from being compromised, getting that PII, or having their workstation compromised, or becoming the victim of a social engineering attempt or a phishing attempt? You got to think about how can organizations reduce their security risks. How can we get in and reduce that, which kind of ties back to individuals. To me, end user training is a huge proponent for reduction analysis. We can get in and have people know what to look for, what not to do. Don't click on attachments from emails that you don't know who they are. Don't accept instant messages that you don't know who they're from. Don't download files illegally from the web. Don't visit questionable websites. Don't give out certain information over the phone. This is also going to help your organization. If you were working at an organization, happened to me one time. I was working with a friend. Security risk, social engineering attempt. I got a phone call. They wanted to know, they were doing a survey for a popular tech magazine. Wanted to know what kind of servers we had. What kind of systems did we use? What kind of support did we have? And I wouldn't answer any of their questions. They ended up calling a colleague of mine and asking the exact same questions. So they were using phishing attempts, right? Trying to get information about our organization. And it may have very well have been legit, but I didn't trust it anyway, so I didn't answer the questions because we could have been targeted for, they could have been doing their footprinting, getting information about a target before they do start doing any scanning or a potential attack. So remediating these threats, go away threats, we don't want you here. We need to get rid of you. At least that's the idea. Well, policies, we could put policies in place can help remediate threats, right? We want something that's called defense in depth, right? They're trying to get to the data. And we put different layers, like layers in an onion, right, of protecting our data. And we have policies out here, those deterrents, right? We have that administrative policies or administrative controls. We have these policies out there of what people can and can't do and shouldn't do, and the consequences of not following the policies. So we could have those in place to help reduce or mitigate some threats. IDSs, IPSs, perimeter devices. So now we're kind of moving down closer to the data, but an intrusion detection system or prevention system. Those could remediate our threats as well. Depending on how we have them configured, we may get alerts, we may get emails, we may get system log messages. Being in a prevention system, we may have that push that traffic over to a protected VLAN or shift that focus and make it go over to a honeypot or a honeynet. So now we can see how the attack's going to take place. Firewalls, right? We can have host-based firewalls. We can have network-based firewalls. Those remediate threats. Those allow or disallow certain traffic to come through into our network or come through into our host. Again, that's another layer of that defense in depth that we want to have. We want an attacker and a threat to come through different layers every time to get to the data. Make it hard for them to get there. Encryption. Encryption is a very big one for remediating threats. If I encrypt the data, even if you get the data, you're not going to be able to understand it. So if I have all these defensive mechanisms in place, even if you are successful enough to get to the data. If I encrypt that data, you can't do anything with it without the encryption key. So you can unlock the data and you can understand what it says. We could use security protocols like SSL, TLS, IPsec. We can use these protocols, again, to encrypt our data, protect our data for data in transit, like for tunneling, for example. Now, not only have we encrypted the data at rest, it's encrypted across the wire. So if you're sniffing traffic or you're looking at it with a packet sniffer or protocol analyzer, you may not understand it. You may see the traffic. You may even capture the traffic, but you're not going to understand what it says because of that encryption. So this is a huge way that we could remediate these threats. Now let's talk about acquisition strategy. When we talk about acquisition strategy, we're going to talk about hardware, software, and services, third-party assessment and monitoring, minimum security requirements, and service level requirements. So for our hardware, our software, and for our services, we need to have redundancy. Have redundancy, that fault tolerance in our organization. Having diversity in our organization is a good idea as well. And diversity means having, say, we got redundancy, maybe we have redundant routers, but the diversity is get the one router from one vendor and maybe the next router from a different vendor. Or if we have redundant firewalls, again, use diversity. Have different vendors for our different materials, for our different controls that we have in place. You know, if we have redundancy, that's great, that's one step, but if we got the same firewall in 3 different spots, they may all have the same vulnerabilities. So if I pop the first firewall, I can get through the second one and third one pretty easily. So that diversity would help us in that attack. Now, it's hard to stop all attacks, and we don't want all our eggs in one basket with one vendor. That's why we want that diversity. Hardware vendors need to meet security requirements for our organization as well. Don't just look for the cheapest. Don't just look for the latest and greatest. Make sure that you get the specs, you get the documentation for the hardware that you're trying to get for protecting your network, for protecting your infrastructure. Make sure they're meeting those security requirements for your organization. Also, make sure they're meeting those import and export requirements that we talked about earlier. Also, service providers, cloud providers, they need to meet our organization's security requirements as well. For, say, data at rest, maybe we have a requirement for encryption. For data in transit, we have a requirement for encryption. Do they meet those standards? When we pass the data from our data center to, say, a cloud provider and back and forth, is that data going to be encrypted along that line? Is the data going to be encrypted when it's sitting on their data center out in the cloud? All right, that could be our security requirement because we have it on our servers. We expect it from them as well. We're only as strong as our weakest link. We don't want that chink in the armor, if you will. If one of these, hardware, software, or services, they don't meet the security requirements that we have, that introduces a what? A vulnerability, that's right. Because they're tied to us. That provider may be tied into us as a service provider. So now instead of an attacker going after us, if they do their homework, they can see, well, we get services from them. They may try to attack the cloud service provider and come in that way. Or maybe all of our data is sitting out there. We can't control it. We have a security policy and we tell them what we expect, but if they don't follow what we expect because we didn't follow up or audit like we should, our data may be more vulnerable that way. It's more of a risk for us to put that data out there, but we may not know it yet. So that's what I mean by only as strong as our weakest link. Because if they're not following policy or the hardware vendors are not following our security policies, they're going to be our weakest link. We definitely don't want to be our own weakest link. So that leads into the third-party assessment and monitoring. Third-party governance is the system of oversight that may be mandated by law, regulation, industry standards, or different licensing requirements. Now, the actual method of governance may vary, but it generally involves an outside investigator or an outside auditor. Somebody is coming in to your organization to make sure you're doing what it is you're supposed to be doing. Now, the auditors may be designated by, say, a governing body, or might be consultants hired by the organization. So you could hire an outside auditor. Say, I need you to come in and take a look and make sure we're following regulations and industry standards, like PCI. Another aspect of third-party governance is the application of security oversight on third parties that our organization relies upon. What I was talking about when I was talking about service providers in the cloud. Our organizations may choose to outsource various aspects of business operations. So we could outsource security guards, maintenance, technical support, accounting services. We could outsource all of that stuff. Now, these parties still need to stay in compliance with the primary organization's security posture or security stance. If not, they present additional risks, they present additional vulnerabilities, like I said just a minute ago, to our organization. Everybody needs to be on the same page when it comes to our security stance and our security policies. Everybody needs to follow suit. So again, that's everybody from our security guards that may be outsourced, but they're still outsourcing to us, maintenance, technical support, and possibly accounting services. Now, a documentation review is the process of reading the exchanged materials, and then you're going to verify them against standards and expectations that we have in our organization. Now, a documentation review is typically performed before any on-site inspections take place. So, like I was talking about the cloud providers, for example, maybe they're doing our accounting, or we hire an accounting firm. Can we see the documentation? Can we take a look and see if everything's good? Make sure they're meeting our standards, make sure they're meeting our expectations of our security policies. And if not, right, if the exchange documentation is sufficient and meets our expectations, all right, that's good. Then the on-site review will be able to focus on compliance with the stated documentation. So I get the documentation. This is what you tell me you're doing. All right. You're meeting our standards. You're meeting our expectations, which is great. Now I'm going to come and see and make sure. But if it's not, if the documentation doesn't meet up, they're going to have to redo that before the on-site to make sure that they're following it before we show up.